Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever and whenever you are listening to this episode of the Hormone Cafe. So my name is Mary Taylor, and this is my really good friend, Amber Horrox, who is an author, a speaker, and a space holder. And if we're looking a little bit chilled out, it's just because we've just been sharing some amazing time together before we jumped on here to do this recording. So it's very unusual, and it's an absolute delight to actually be face to face and in person with the person I'm interviewing. So at times we may be talking to each other, we might turn back and talk to you, but this is a conversation I really wanted to share with you, because I know for many of us the subject of migraines is so debilitating. I'm very fortunate. I don't think I've ever experienced a migraine in my entire life. It's not something I could explain to you. It's not something I've got experience of. Unfortunately for Amber, this is a very, very different story. And what I wanted to be able to do today is to share different approaches, because one of the purposes of the Hormone Cafe is to show different insights. This is not to diss the medical system, but maybe we get to a point in our lives where we're feeling we keep going down roads and they keep meeting blocks or dead ends, and we want to feel a little bit empowered and to be able to take back some control of our lives. So I thought it would be really interesting to invite Amber on to talk to us about her experience, and also because she is in the process of writing a book as well that is going to be able to support anybody who doesn't get to see her in person. So maybe, Amber, you could start just by sharing a little bit of your story with us, and then we can dive in and unpick it and pull it apart.
Okay then. So I'll start at the beginning. My first experience of a migraine attack was in around 1998. It was in the middle of the night, and it was complete and utter agony. At the time, I had no idea what was happening. I actually thought I was dying. The pain was so agonizing. And then in the morning, it was as if nothing had happened. You would have never known that I'd been in pain to that extent. You wouldn't have even known I'd been unwell. It was as if nothing had happened energy-wise. Wellness, the pain had completely gone.
Can I just ask how old you were at that time?
Yeah, I was about 18.
Right,
yeah,
okay.
I was 18.
Yeah. I didn't know that, but it's really interesting in the work that I do, because quite often when I'm talking to a woman or somebody later on in life and sort of saying, well, when did this all start? 18 seems to be quite a pivotal time for a lot of people. And I don't know if for some people that's linked to the pressure of A-levels, or maybe because in their hormonal journey, because when we start our periods at puberty, that's not it. It's not just a case of, oh, you've started your periods and you're done, you're now a menstruating person, or it can take a couple of years sometimes for everything to settle and for the hormones to work out where they are. So I'm quite curious if that's also part of the mix outside of this subject, but in general, as to why 18 is quite pivotal.
So for me, actually, although from my research and the approach that I've taken, which we'll come on to talk about shortly, I can completely see that being part of the big picture. But with that particular attack, it was what's known as post-concussion migraine or post-concussion syndrome. So probably around the year before, I'd actually received a blow to the back of the head.
Oh, okay.
Which previously, where I've experienced concussion on the back of that as well. And previously, it was thought that concussion was a 24-hour, 48-hour thing, and there was no further long-lasting damage to the head or the brain. We now know that's not the case, and it took me a few years to work it out, because I literally thought I was dying. The pain was that agonizing. Once I realized that I wasn't dying and I was in fact still alive, I kind of traced it back myself to that. Went into a period of quite dark depression after the first attack as well. which is synonymous with post-concussion migraine or post-concussion syndrome. So for me, that particular type of attack, which was sporadic, you know, it wouldn't be in line with the menstrual cycle or hormone fluctuations. It literally, you know, it could be from one year to the next. It's just something that I've experienced on I'd say quite an irregular basis, but every now and again for the last 25 years in total. It's now a year and a half since I've experienced pain to that kind of agony and extent.
Can I ask what caused the concussion? What had happened?
It was a blow to the back of the head. Yeah,
right, okay. Yeah.
I received at the age of 17.
Right, okay. But again, it's something to be aware of, isn't it? So any kind of blow to the back of the head, maybe you've fallen during gymnastics, maybe it's been in rugby, horse riding, you know, when you think of all of on skiing trip, tripping and falling, like you say, it's very hard initially to think it might be related to something that happened a year ago, 2 years ago, because I'd never heard of that before. So thank you for sharing that.
And there's a book, just for any listeners who might be interested in reading any materials or subjects on migraine, of personal stories. There's a book called 10. Can't remember the name of it, but I can't remember the name of it right off the top of my head. But
I'll have a look while you're talking.
Fabulous, yeah. It's a survival guide, something like a survival guide for migraine or a person's lived experience. And something had happened to her. I think, was she about 8, or she was a young person herself, and she'd taken a fall or passed out, something like that, hit the back of her head, and that was what was thought or known to have been the start and the triggering of her attacks that were as a result of that.
Right.
I think it's more common than we realise, actually. Yeah. I think it's something like all things migraine, perhaps listeners you'll definitely relate, is it's so misunderstood. You know, it's so misunderstood. It's so complex. It's now known as the world's most complex neurological disorder, and the most common.
Right.
Yeah, the most common disease now in men as well as women.
Yeah, I know my
children.
I know my partner can suffer from migraines, particularly when he gets very, very stressed. Yeah. But I also know, again, through the work that I do, that it's something a lot of women will suffer with. And, you know, it's been so interesting just listening to this already, because, you know, the first thing I'll say is there a pattern? You know, do you notice it mid-cycle or just before your period? So, you know, those can be two really common times.
Very much so.
To get a migraine. And it can also be something that becomes more prevalent as we move into perimenopause and menopause. It's
most common and debilitating for women in the mid-30s, and I think that's down to the hormones, the career, the having children later, the stress, you know, just a whole combination of factors.
Okay, so you just said this is something that you've been suffering with for almost 25 years. The last year and a half has been a lot happier, a lot calmer. Talk us through how you went from that first attack and then those feelings of depression and so on afterward. What route did you go down, and where have you ended up now?
So initially it was my understanding and belief that if you had anything serious, a health condition, anything of that severity, then the first port of call would be to go to the doctors and register it with your doctors. That was something I did time and again for 20 years. And each time I was dismissed. I was told it wasn't migraine. The only reason I knew it to be migraine myself is because I grew up with a childhood friend whose mum suffered from migraine attacks, and we used to massage her head. So that was my association. And when I would present that to the doctor, I'd be told it wasn't, it was too hard to diagnose, etc., etc. That went on for 20 years. I took the combination pill in my early 20s, spoke to them about that, was told it had nothing to do with the pill. Then, of course, later on, we did find out it was very much linked to the pill, the combination pill. And yeah, that went on for 20 years. And my coping mechanism and strategy was, unbeknown to me, to numb out as much as possible through drink, drugs, sex, TV, shopping, food, work, you name it, one to the other, to the other, to the other, for the next couple of decades until I reached my mid-30s, experienced a lot of trauma and stress in my life around that time. Mentally took a downfall, had a breakdown, and still ignored all the signs, still went to the doctors multiple times, was eventually diagnosed with tension headache. By this point, I was barely able to function. And by the time I was permitted to see a neurologist, I was already completely disabled by the illness, unable to work, unable to get out of bed, unable to function, with no mortgage insurance, no sick pay, and no family to help. And it was for me that it was at that point that I see as an awakening. You know, that is what it took for me to wake up to the severity and the seriousness of this illness, irrespective of what, you know, the doctors and the specialists and loved ones and work colleagues and family and friends, you know, were all kind of voicing to me at the time. And that was 5 years ago. Yeah, so that was 5 years ago. And I woke up one day with a newfound belief that I matter, my health matters. And the next day, I only know this through having had kept a journal on the back of being encouraged to do that, following some counselling for 3.5 years after my breakdown. And in my journal, I'd written that, and how I knew that changes were what I needed to make. Changes were what it was going to take to get me from where I was, completely disabled by illness, unable to function, to anywhere, which I didn't know where that was. You know, I just took on the fight for my life. And yeah, I did a random search of a migraine meditation on a meditation app that I happened to have on my phone. Completely changed my relationship with the migraine, the disease, the pain.
Through the meditation?
Through the meditation. One meditation 1 week, and I did it again the week after, and it had completely shifted. I was still in very severe and agonising pain all day, every day. Pain relief by this point had become immune to it. But it completely shifted the relationship. I was at one time really holding on. The pain was very aggressive, very ingrained, very red, very violent, very holding on. And the next week there was a release had happened. It was calmer, and it had put me, the way I look at it, it put me on a whole new trajectory of hope and healing from that moment forward.
Okay, so we're all like, I don't know if you are, I'm like, I meditate. And, you know, and let's not dismiss the fact, you know, I think we are being taught more and more the power of meditation, of mindfulness, of, you know, was it a guided meditation? It was a guided meditation, migraine specific. It got you to actually connect with the pain, give it a colour. Right, hence why you're like, it's right. That's where and I really was surprised to find that as well. You know, I really was surprised to find it was a shock to me that it was so ingrained and so violent, because I'd been ignoring it for 20 years and numbing out until that no longer served me, that no longer worked. You know, that no longer enabled me to ignore the seriousness of what was going on. Yeah, and it's very interesting, isn't it? Because when, you know, you're talking about, you know, numbing out with alcohol and with drugs and with sex and with shopping and so on, and some of these are also causing even further inflammation in the body, which is then in turn affecting the neural pathways, brain health, etc., being on the contraceptive pill. Absolutely. And again, you know, do your own research. I'm going to share another brilliant podcast around that. But, you know, being on the contraceptive pill depletes us some of the nutrients that we need in order for, you know, for good brain health, for, you know, good everything. Luckily for me, my ex-partner at the time had a neighbour who was a neurologist, and he asked the neurologist what I should do. Wow. And he said, irrespective
of what pill you are on, or your girlfriend's on, irrespective of whether it's the combination pill, the mini pill, whatever it is, tell her to come off.
Right. Okay.
And that, it's given me goosebumps. I'm so thankful for that now. I'm 5 years of having the contraceptive pill out, or any form of contraception out of my system.
And did you notice a difference straight away? Did it take a while? Or
I'd like to say that I did, but bearing in mind I was completely disabled by illness, and we're talking severe and agonising pain all day, every day. There were about 25 symptoms in the end when I came to understand them. I physically was unable to eat, speak, drink, move, get out of bed for up to 24 days a month at the peak. So to say that some of the changes that I made brought about radical results instantly, isn't a fair reflection.
Yes.
I was in it for the long game. I was no longer looking for a quick fix, an overnight solution, a magic potion. I came to realise it simply didn't exist. And about 6 months into my journey of making teeny tiny changes, one small change at a time, I really did come to see that actually this series of small changes, one at a time, really taking my time without the pressure and stress, which was a complete turnaround for me, by the way, from the person that I was previously, led to the biggest change down the line.
Yeah.
It really, really, really has.
And I think that's a really key point, whether we're talking about coming out of this debilitating illness, whether it's about perimenopause, fibromyalgia. We have to be able to play the long game, don't we? And particularly, when you've lived with something for almost 20 years, like you say, to all of a sudden drink the holy water and, be walking again, we would all love that, but it's not, definitely it's not plausible. And it's that resilience almost. So again, it's the newfound resilience, isn't there? There's that resilience to be able to say, I'm going to allow the 1% teeny tiny changes every day, because fundamentally what we're doing, and again, I look at this from the perspective of hormonal or particularly perimenopause and menopause health, is we're unpicking maybe 2-3 decades of living a certain way, eating a certain way, behaving a certain way. And if we do it all in one go, that in itself is really damaging for the body. It's too shocking.
So, yeah.
So we have to be able to go, okay, one day at a time, one step at a time, little bit, a little bit more, until we can then, peel away like the layers of the onion. So what you said, there was all different types of migraine. So again, that's quite new to me to know. Can you maybe share some of the different, because again, some of the listeners might not be aware, and that everything is just given, I'm assuming, the umbrella term migraine.
Yeah, I mean, in the end, I was diagnosed with classic migraine, and I came to find that there was nothing classic about the migraine disease and pain that I was living with and experienced. And it was only on the back of my own research, which then kind of followed that awakening or a massive wake-up call, where I read and read and read. I watched webinars, attended workshops, got really involved with the Migraine World Summit, which was one of the biggest resources I had for connecting in with the world's top neurologists and headache specialists, combined with a holistic healing approach of the whole body. It was through that I came to understand that not only were the different types of attack, post-migraine, post-concussion migraine, menstrual migraine, cluster attack, hemiplegic. There's probably a dozen or more. Even the word sinus headache, they're now saying there is no such thing as sinus headache. It's all migraine attack. It's all migraine attack. And actually, they're even moving away. I don't fully understand it yet myself because it's quite new to me. They're actually even starting to move away from that and describe migraine as a spectrum.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So some people may go down the medical route and they feel great and it does what it needs to do. What we want to talk about is all the other stuff that goes in and around it, and the lifestyle changes and what you found from your research did and didn't work. Because again, like everything, you know, we can take our HRT, we can take, you know, things like that, but, and I say that with love, it's always great to put the lifestyle framework around it, like you said, the holistic healing. So can you maybe talk about some of the some tips, ideas, things that the listeners might want to consider to support their healing journey?
I think first and foremost, I'll share something with you that the co-founder of Migraine World Summit shared this year, quite a bold statement, and definitely part of the approach that I took in conjunction with a couple of other things, which I'll come on to. He shared that researching this disease alone, just researching, reading up about it, understanding about it, no need, not even necessarily any need to go off and make any changes, will reduce your migraine attacks by 50%. Which is pretty bold and pretty out there. And I would have to say I'd agree with that. You know, for me, it's been substantially higher.
Isn't that about, because that's about awareness, isn't it? That's about empowerment. That's like all of a sudden understanding, which is again where we are with menopause, isn't it? There's so much more conversation about it. We don't have to fear it anymore. It doesn't have that big red angry grip on us anymore, because we can dissipate it. Okay, right, wow, okay, so just go and do some. And maybe what I'll do is I'll get Amber to share some links and things, and we can put them in the show notes, and then people can go and have a look at that.
Fabulous, yeah. And then for me, alongside that, you know, I really now look back, you know, as horrific and as desolate and as desperate as those times were, you know, finding myself kind of migraine and disabled, unable to work. I now see that as a gift, because, you know, essentially I was gifted this time. And as I described to people, healing for me has been a 24/7 job. However, on the flip side, chronic illness and complete disability by illness is also a 24/7 job. So for me, it was flipping that and focusing on my wellness. It was at the time in the early stages. I really see that time as a gift, because that time was gifted to me to sit there with it, to be present with it, to research it, to understand it, to make the changes that I've made alongside the research that see me as well as I am today. And one of the things I'll move on to next, which I think will be super relevant for your listeners and watchers, is my kind of move towards hormones and the way that I approached that, and started making changes in my life based around rebalancing my hormones. So about 6 months into this journey, a friend recommended a book called Balance Your Hormones, Balance Your Life. And I started reading that book. Now, it is a big book, which I didn't realise at the time. For me, I'd already started making the changes. So when I was reading about all these changes, which can sometimes come over a bit overwhelming at times,
sometimes more like a confirmation.
I started making the changes, and I just thought, thank goodness, you know, I've got 10 years. I was reading about menopause for the first time in my life, you know, perimenopause, hormonal imbalance, what that looks like, women's health, all the implications of women's health, you know, osteoporosis, endometriosis, menopause, etc. And I just remember feeling so thankful that I had 10 years on my side to really get to grips with what was going on before I
got into that phase of life.
Yeah.
Okay. So what were you doing? So when you're saying I was 6 months in, let's just, in terms of timelines, this was 6 months in, 20 years after. So 20 years of living,
4.5 years ago from today.
So 20 years of living to the point where we were completely debilitated. What were the changes that you started to make from a holistic perspective?
I initially started to make changes based around what I couldn't do anymore. You know, because at that point of, you know, suffering and pain, to start going around and making kind of changes can be really tough, really grueling. So my approach was to look at what I couldn't do anymore. I couldn't drink alcohol. I physically was unable.
Right, I've got you. Okay.
I couldn't drink caffeine. I was physically unable. And I made those the two choices and set the intent and made the commitment there and then that you know, there were either to be no more or to be certainly, you know, moderately reduced and not. It was essentially binge drinking. You know, I was drinking like 10 cups of coffee from a freshly ground coffee a day. I was, you know, excessively binge drinking on a weekend, every weekend. And so, yeah, it was a complete stop to those.
I'm just going to jump in because we're going to sound like the fun police now. And some people might say, oh, but you were binge drinking. You were binge drinking coffee. Is alcohol and coffee something that we recommend to stop if we are suffering with migraines? And if so, why?
Do you know what? I think it's about tuning in to you, tuning into your own body and your own inner knowing. Because for me, the message I don't want to spread is this is how I've done it. This is how you must do it.
Yes, absolutely.
How I did it was I tuned into my own inner knowing, and that was, you know, when I sit and think about what I am most proud of in my entire life, it is that moment where I drowned out the noise around me and I tuned into my own inner knowing. So some people don't want to stop alcohol yet or caffeine yet, and that's okay.
But are they triggers?
You do want to
I'm just curious, are they triggers? And I get you might not want to, but
yeah, that's a really good question actually, and really worth exploring, because alcohol for me was a trigger all day every day. For 20 years I lived with hangover, migraine hangover. I never saw it that way. I was so numbed out, but the pain was severe. I would be sick 6 to 12 times with every hangover. And I've heard a neurologist say that apparently if alcohol is a trigger, then the person will stop drinking. You know, that wasn't me. That wasn't me. I continued on regardless, and I lived like that for a very long time. Caffeine, I found really interesting. You know, that is one of the changes that I made. Caffeine, I've come to see as an indirect trigger.
Okay.
So, and I see this a lot in the migraine community. You know, we'll pull back, we'll stop drinking caffeine for 6, 12, 24 months. Not really necessarily feel a connection or a difference, and then think, oh, well, sod it, we might as well go back on it.
And is that when you notice it or not?
I've done it a couple of times. What I noticed for me was the addiction to the caffeine. So I think that's where the indirect. So yeah, it's the addiction to the caffeine. Even though I was drinking much smaller amounts, I was drinking 1 or 2 cups every day, and I had to have the 1 or 2 cups. If I didn't have access to caffeine or didn't drink a coffee that day, I would become agitated. And for me, that's the indirect trigger. So if I became agitated, particularly pre-period in autumn week, then I was guaranteed a migraine attack. So that's where I would consider it an indirect trigger. Yeah.
So this really, what I'm really hearing you saying, like everything in life, and this is why there's no one fix for anybody, is really learning to get quiet and still and listen to your body. Absolutely. And how it responds. And you know, and I can remember years ago I used to do a lot of work working with women with pelvic floor dysfunction. And one of the women came to realise that when she had wine at the weekend, she would wet herself maybe on a Monday or a Tuesday, because the wine was acting as an irritant. Yeah. So, you know, she had a choice then. And then another lady, we actually managed to narrow it down to the aspartame and the chemicals in the squash that she was drinking. The minute she stopped drinking that squash, bladder sort of stopped being so irritated and thing. So again, we're all unique and we're all individual. And I know it sounds like I'm trying to get Amber to say, is it alcohol and caffeine they need to give up? And what you're really, and I'm loving how you're saying it is, depends on the individual.
Absolutely. I didn't want to give up alcohol for 20 years, you know. Nothing would have made me give that up, you know, like and again, it's a hard one, isn't it? Because we live in a society where alcohol is the only socially acceptable drug.
And I will say it, and I'll keep saying it, unfortunately as well, it really doesn't help our liver, and our liver health is so integral to our hormonal health, and particularly as we get later into perimenopause and menopause. So there's maybe lots of benefits. There's lots of benefits to looking at what your triggers are and releasing them. But, you know, for me, there is a genuine reason for removing alcohol, or copious amounts of alcohol, or being able to, if we love a drink at the weekend, managing it and knowing that there may be some little consequences. So alcohol and caffeine were first.
Yeah. Coming off the pill, changing the environment I was in, and then I started looking at dietary changes.
Right.
To start off, I think this is probably quite an important one to talk about, because it can, quite often we think we need to go out there and change our diet drastically, lose 2 stone, hit the gym 3 times a week. From the point of just complete debilitation, that is far from possible. And it kind of tuning in and listening to my own inner knowing opened up enough space for me to connect with the knowing that I was going to have to do this gently. I was going to have to do this slowly. I was going to have to do this without the pressure and the stress that played a huge part in the situation I then found myself in. So yeah, for me, I really just toyed around with the idea of a little bit of cutting gluten out. I heard about cutting gluten out of my diet for the benefit of migraine attacks and reducing them. I asked my neurologist about making that change. He actually said he wouldn't, I wouldn't bother. I went ahead and sat with that anyway and continued to research that. I started picking up a few odd little items. I was shopping in Aldi at the time, and I would pick up nut bars, raw nut bars and fruit bars, and just becoming more mindful of products that contain gluten, and just no radical changes, just 1 or 2 things that were that bit cleaner that I wouldn't have picked up before.
Is there any research around gluten and migraine?
So then I joined. I was absolutely desperate for support, as you might imagine, beyond desperate for support. And after asking my neurologist if there was any support available to me and having crystal clear confirmation there was absolutely none at all whatsoever, I then found a chronic migraine support group, and the book The Migraine Miracle was recommended on there, and I ordered that straight away. That was the added to the start of my journey, and really in researching migraine specifically, and I highly recommend that book for explaining it in a simple and easy to digest and understand way. He actually talks about the way we used to eat historically and bringing that diet back in with a view to reducing inflammation in the body, which really was, before I got onto the balance and the hormone side of things, my first protocol was to reduce that inflammation in the body. And one thing I particularly liked about this book, for me, he broke it down. So he was like, number 1, cut out gluten and sugar. Number 2, can't remember what it is off the top of my head, reduce the oils, use healthy fats, olive oil, coconut oil, scrap the sunflower and the vegetable oil, that kind of thing. And it was broken down number by number. And even with the first number, cut out gluten and sugar, I worked with just 1. I worked with gluten, and I did that over a series of a few weeks, a few months, really went for it about 2 or 3 months in, and embedded that one change before I moved on to the next one, which was several weeks later. I then cut out sugar, and really did it, kind of slow and easy does it way.
So alcohol, caffeine, then looked at your diet in terms of your nutrition. What else?
So the environment side of things, the pill. Alongside that, I was meditating. Meditation has been absolutely huge for me. It's free. YouTube has any type of meditation you could possibly hope to search for. Anxiety reducing, chronic pain, migraine, healing, new moon, full moon. It's just endless. And then understanding more about hormonal health.
So tell us a little bit more about that.
On one after the other. So reading Balance Your Hormones, Balance Your Life. So what I love about the author of that book, she takes a very complex subject and explains it in a more easier to digest and understand way. And she's very clear.
Right.
It takes years to rebalance your hormones. For me, that's not a reason not to go ahead and do that. I've seen, particularly in the medical field, it takes too long, it's too much work, it's too much effort. And I guess this is where you need to get clear on what it is you want as well, which I think is really important. For me, it was wellness.
Yeah.
I wanted to get well. And anything that aligned with wellness, I did it. Whether I saw immediate results or not, it didn't matter, because my end goal was wellness, with a whole shit ton of hope that that was where I was going to take me. I knew that in the other direction, there was no hope. There was no chance of me ever getting well. So it was worth the risk for me and the gamble at the time. And it took me 3 years.
Okay.
3 years. And then at the same time found out that menstrual migraine is the most difficult and challenging of all migraine types to overcome.
Wow.
It is the most severe and disabling of all migraine types to come. And it is also the most medication resistant. And that made a lot of sense, because it did take me 3 years.
Sure, there's been a few, light bulbs there of it's the most difficult, it's the most challenging, and it's the most medically resistant. Okay. So how do we support, are we back? How do we support hormonal migraines then, or menstrual migraines?
Checking in with your cycle.
Right.
Really, what's the word? What's the word where you know where you...
Oh, right, menstrual cycle awareness.
Yeah. So...
all that stuff I just bang on about.
Yeah. Okay. Everything she says. Literally, but again, just starting small, one change at a time, one step at a time.
Is that because we're looking to see, is there certain times a month with menstrual cycle migraines? Yeah, so there's just before you're due on your period, or as you're coming on your period, right,
and just after. So for me, it was both. And at one time, and for a long time, I was losing 2.5 weeks of the month in its entirety to 2 attacks.
Right, okay. Because I know as well you can get them at ovulation.
And from what I understand about ovulation, that is the peak of our month, the lover element of the month. And if we're experiencing attacks or any kind of imbalance at that time, it's to do with being too scattered.
Oh, okay.
Too scattered,
So, and also at those times, as we go into ovulation, we've got this transfer over from estrogen to progesterone just before our period. And did you say just after our period? Yeah. So just before, we've got that big drop of all of the hormones, and then just after, we've got the estrogen starting to rise.
So from what I understand, with those of us who suffer from migraines at that particular time of the month, that drop that we see naturally in people who experience migraine attacks is much greater than those without.
So it's almost like an elevator falling to the base of the thing rather than gently coming down floor by
really
floor.
Good analogy. Yeah. And to me, it was all about kind of raising that up slightly to be more in balance.
Yeah. So again, from that perspective, we're going to be looking then at our stress. We're going to be looking at our busyness.
Yeah.
We're going to be looking at our nutrition.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Our sleep.
Yeah.
That whole holistic side of well-being, rather than just sticking on a plaster on it or superwomaning through and then finding, like you did, I've lost 2. For the sake of, I'm really simplifying this, and I'm also very respectful that not all of us are in a situation where we can just rest or take some time out or choose not to do something because the kids or the family or the work, or we're both self-employed at the moment. I'm definitely always child free at the moment. You don't have a family. So there's those elements of, oh, it's easy for you. It's easy for you. We can just say, no, not available today, or there's no one, knocking on the door, and so on and so forth. But I think we can still look at ways to support ourselves, and maybe as a whole family go, okay, these are the times of the month where please don't be overbooking, or, if you want mummy to be fine and well, maybe, daddy needs to pick up what, and then, then someone might say, but I'm a single parent. I'm sure your kids would enjoy a Netflix duvet day every now and again as well. We don't have to be on this 24-hour, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year, constantly on the treadmill doing.
Absolutely. And one of the biggest lessons I've learned is the power of saying no. So whilst you might not be able to let everything go or make massive amount of changes in a manner, just really sit with the question, what can I say no to? And for me, that's the biggest yee-haw from my body. Every time I say no, which was very difficult at first, this stuff really is that simple, but it's, not that easy to implement at first. It's a lot easier for me now. I've been practicing, and that's the way I would encourage you to look at it as well, as a practice. Those little pockets in the week leading up to my period and during my period of where I actually step back and say, no, these are my responsibilities. These are, my must-dos, my must-haves. There's no getting around that, but what can I say no to outside of that? And even just kind of 1 or 2 or 3 things, just for me, I feel that's a big signal to the body, and the body goes, she's listening.
Yeah, beautiful. So I'm just mindful of everybody's time and attention. I've found that really, really fascinating, and I'm really blessed. I do get to talk to Amber as much or as little as I want. I hope you found that really interesting. And again, the whole purpose of the Hormone Cafe is not to say come off your medication, stop your pill, do this or do that, but to just simply share other insights, bring in experts, because Amber is an expert in her migraine experience, and she may have shared something today that just makes you feel a little bit more empowered or a little bit more hopeful. Particularly, I think, what you said about menstrual migraines being the most challenging and the hardest to manage medically. If you are someone that sat there feeling hopeless, and you're taking the medication and you're being the good girl and doing all the things that you're meant to, maybe it's time for a little check-in and looking at other aspects of your life that you can manage. I know for some of you are mums, and you may have a teenage daughter, or it might be your sister or a niece or a nephew, because obviously boys get migraines as well. And just sharing and reflecting, and maybe going and look at some of the resources that we're going to put underneath to see how that can support you having a better quality of life, because that's fundamentally what this is all about. Is, as you felt, all of a sudden it's like, I feel empowered, even if it's that tiny little change I've made a little bit, I feel back in control and command of myself and my body. What would you like to leave the listeners with? You sort of like your number one top tip, or if someone comes to you and they're feeling so, maybe where you were, or so debilitated, or just so, I don't know where to go anymore, what would be your...
I'm just going to share what comes up intuitively, and it would be to recognize that you have a choice. Recognize that you have a choice, and even the teeniest, tiniest little ones, which could be completely disbanded and disregarded and seen as too simple, too quick, too easy, not worth it. Recognize that you do have a choice, no matter how small. That really will make all the difference.
And if you want to reach out to Amber or read some of her amazing insights,
please do.
How do we find you?
I have a Substack page which shares all aspects of my story called Warrior Within, and my main social media platform is LinkedIn. So Warrior Within is under Warrior Within, and LinkedIn is under my name in full, Amber Horrox.
And that's with an X. But we'll put all of the links below. So thank you so much for your time and your attention today. I really hope that you have found this incredibly useful. I know I have, because I can ask better questions now when I'm supporting any of my clients that come to me with, you know, with migraines, because it's very hard sometimes, if you've never experienced something, to be completely empathetic. But just knowing that there's such a wide range and that they can be triggered by something a few years ago, but also to remember that, you know, a lot of the lifestyle interventions that Amber was sharing, and this is something that I've come to know to be true, is all of those things that Amber was sharing are also what we share to say to offset dementia. And what we say to, because they're all about reducing inflammation, and lots of our lifestyle diseases are all down to inflammation. They would be the same tips and advice that I would give someone in perimenopause and menopause. So that in itself for me makes it really simple, because yes, we need to take bio-individuality into account, but fundamentally we're looking at reducing inflammation, reducing stress, getting more rest, more joy, playing the long game, looking at our long-term health, surrounding, you know, it was interesting environment. We didn't dive deep into that, but we're looking at not just our spatial environment, but the people that we're allowing in and out of our lives,
where you work, the environment in your body,
yeah,
you know, what we listen to, what we watch,
what you're spraying in your house, what you're cleaning with, or, you know, that's maybe another subject for another day. So anyway, thank you so much for your time today. It's been an absolute pleasure. I've learned a little bit more about my good friend Amber, and I hope that you have found it useful. And please do reach out or go and read her Substack, because I'm sure you will find inspirational messages, and we're all waiting for her book when it arrives. No pressure there, then, love. Take care, everybody. Thank you, and bye-bye.
Bye-bye.